Today's story is titled, On My Birthday. Mom said we never loved you. In front of 30 guests, I smiled and said thank you. The room had been filled with laughter only seconds earlier. 30 people who knew my work, my loyalty, and the life I had built were raising their glasses when my mother suddenly stood up. She did not smile. She did not ask permission. She looked around the room as if she were about to reveal a family secret and said, "Let me be honest, we never loved you." Every conversation died. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. My father stared at the table, but the look on his face told me something even worse. He was not surprised. My mother watched me carefully, waiting for me to cry, beg, or collapse in front of everyone. Instead, I placed my plate down, stood up, and smiled. "Thank you for the honesty," I said. Then I picked up my coat and walked out without looking back. She thought she had humiliated me on my own birthday. What she did not know was that I had spent months quietly preparing for the moment I would finally stop holding our family together. By the next morning, my phone showed 53 missed calls, frantic messages about insurance passwords, doctor appointments, prescriptions, and one confession from my father that changed everything I believed about that night. Stay until the end, because the truth behind my mother's cruel announcement, the secret life I had already arranged, and the consequences that followed will deliver a twist far more satisfying than any revenge I could have planned. The calm way I walked out of that birthday party did not begin in that room. It began months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday morning when no one around me would have guessed that anything in my life was about to change. My name is Claire Thompson. I was 29 years old and worked as an event planner at a boutique firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I had built a reputation for noticing every detail before it became a problem. I could manage nervous brides, demanding executives, late florists, missing place cards, and last-minute seating disasters without raising my voice. What I could not manage, though I had spent years trying, was the way my own family treated my time as if it belonged to them. That Tuesday, I sat at my desk with a phone wedged between my shoulder and ear while answering emails with both hands. 4 browser tabs were open in front of me. One showed the floor plan for a spring wedding. One contained a seating chart that had already been revised 6 times. Another displayed a vendor invoice I needed to approve before noon. The last was my parents' insurance portal, where I had been waiting more than 20 minutes for someone to help me reset my mother's password. My coffee sat beside the keyboard, untouched and already cold. When the representative finally answered, I confirmed my mother's information, reset the account, and wrote the new login details in a file I kept for my parents. Years earlier, they had signed the proper authorization forms allowing me to help manage their insurance and medical accounts. At first, it had seemed harmless. My father hated computers, and my mother became impatient whenever a website asked her to verify her identity. I told myself that helping them was simply what a good daughter did. Over time, however, I stopped helping and started handling. I tracked prescription refills, appointment dates, renewal notices, account passwords, and billing questions. I knew which pharmacy closed early on Saturdays and which doctor required 48 hours notice for cancellations. My parents rarely asked how much time any of it took. They only noticed when something had not yet been done. After I reset the password, I texted my mother to tell her the problem was fixed. Her reply came quickly. "Thank you, honey. You are so good at this stuff." The message sounded warm, but it also carried the assumption that I would always be available. By 10 o'clock, I had reminded my father to refill his blood pressure medication, moved one of my mother's medical appointments, sent her the grocery list for Sunday dinner, answered 2 client calls, and corrected a florist's order. None of those tasks felt dramatic. That was what made them dangerous. They had become so ordinary that even I no longer questioned why I was responsible for all of them. My mother, Sandra, had always operated as though every important decision required her approval. She never called it control. She called it concern, experience, or simply being involved. When I chose a college, she insisted on visiting every campus before I submitted an application. When I rented my first apartment, She wanted photographs of the building, the street, and the kitchen. When I painted one wall in my living room, a soft blue, she spent an entire dinner explaining why warmer colors would have been more flattering. The first time I made a decision without asking her, she did not shout or insult me. She withdrew. For 3 days, her voice became cool and distant. Every conversation felt like standing outside a locked house. By the end of the 3rd day, I apologized, even though the decision had been mine to make. That was how she taught me to consult her without ever directly demanding it. My father, Ray, was different, but not different enough. He was kind in private. He told me I was smart and said he was proud of my work. Yet whenever my mother pushed too far, he lowered his eyes or changed the subject. His favorite phrase was, "You know how she is," as if her behavior were weather and the rest of us simply needed to carry umbrellas. I loved him, and I believed he loved me, but I had slowly learned that his affection came with a limit. He would comfort me after a conflict, but he would not risk creating one to protect me. That evening, I called my best friend, Jess Morales, from my apartment. Jess had known me since college and had never developed the polite habit of pretending unhealthy things were normal. I told her about the insurance account, the prescriptions, the appointment, the grocery list, and the coffee I had forgotten to drink. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked when I had last completed something for myself, before stopping to solve someone else's problem. I laughed, but the sound felt thin. I could not remember. Jess said I had become so reliable that everyone around me had stopped noticing the cost. She compared it to pouring from an empty cup, while continuing the motion because I was afraid someone might see that nothing remained. While she spoke, my phone lit up with a calendar notification reminding me that my birthday was 9 months away. Beneath the date was a simple question asking whether I wanted to plan an event. I stared at it. I planned important moments for other people every day, yet my own birthdays usually became dinners selected by my mother at restaurants she preferred. Even the cake was often a flavor she liked better than I did. I touched the screen and selected yes. Jess asked what had caught my attention. I told her I was going to plan my birthday properly this year. She paused before saying that sounded good. She understood, perhaps before I did, that I was not talking only about food, flowers, or music. I wanted one room in my life where every choice had been made by me. I wanted to invite people who knew who I was, without hearing my mother explain me first. I wanted my parents to arrive as guests, rather than owners of the occasion. At that moment, it still felt like a small decision. I had no idea that by choosing to plan one evening for myself, I had begun separating my life from theirs, one quiet detail at a time. Once I decided that my birthday would belong to me, I began noticing how rarely anything else in my life had. The pattern was not built from one terrible event. It was built from dozens of smaller moments, each easy to excuse on its own, until together they formed something I could no longer ignore. 3 years earlier, I had organized Thanksgiving for our extended family. My mother had mentioned that she wanted a traditional dinner that felt special, so I took care of nearly everything. I ordered a heritage turkey from a farm outside Concord, drove 40 minutes to pick it up, planned the menu, coordinated side dishes with 2 aunts, and arranged the seating for 22 people. I pressed the table linens the night before and woke before sunrise to begin cooking. By the time everyone arrived, the house smelled of rosemary, butter, and roasted vegetables. My mother accepted compliments on the table, as if the room had assembled itself around her. I did not mind that at first. I was accustomed to working behind the scenes. During dinner, one of my aunts asked about my job. Before I could answer, my mother smiled and said she was relieved I had finally found something stable, because she had once worried I might never settle into a serious career. The comment was delivered lightly, almost affectionately, which made it difficult to challenge without appearing overly sensitive. Around the table, a few people nodded. I looked at the meal I had planned, the guests I had coordinated, and the details I had managed while working a full week at the office. I wanted to say that I had been steadily employed since college, that I had earned promotions, and that the dinner everyone was enjoying existed because I had organized it. Instead, I passed the sweet potatoes. Later, after the last dish was washed, I sat in my car, in my parents' driveway, before turning the key. I watched the closed garage door and tried to understand why I felt ashamed when I had done nothing wrong. 14 months before my birthday, another moment followed the same pattern. I had been promoted to senior event coordinator. It was the kind of promotion I had worked toward for years, and I went to dinner at my parents' house, believing, foolishly, that the news might remain good for more than a few seconds. My father smiled and told me he was proud. His happiness was genuine, and I held on to it. My mother placed her fork beside her plate and warned me not to let work become my entire identity. She said men often found ambitious women intimidating and reminded me that success could become lonely. I had not mentioned dating. I had not asked for advice. I had simply told them I had earned a better position. Yet, within moments, my accomplishment had been transformed into evidence that something might be wrong with me. I thanked her, because that was easier than defending myself. My father looked down and continued eating. We moved on to a conversation about the weather. On the drive home, I replayed the exchange and wondered why I had expected anything different. That was the question I kept avoiding. I knew my mother's habits. I knew my father would not challenge her. Still, I returned to the same table and offered them each new piece of my life, hoping this one might be treated carefully. For years, I called that hope loyalty. I called my silence maturity. I told myself that family relationships required patience and that my mother's criticism came from concern. The truth was less flattering. I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped cooperating. Her withdrawal had trained me well. A cold voice, a canceled dinner, or a week of distance could still make me feel like a child waiting outside a locked room. I had become skilled at preventing those punishments before they arrived. I softened my opinions, announced decisions as questions, and presented achievements modestly enough that they would not threaten her. The better I became at keeping the peace, the less anyone noticed that peace was costing me something. Jess noticed. A few nights after I began thinking seriously about my birthday, she came over with takeout and found me reviewing my savings account at the kitchen table. She asked whether I was worried about money. I told her no, which was mostly true. I had always been careful. What I wanted now was enough freedom to make a decision without explaining it first. Jess studied me for a moment and asked what kind of decision I was considering. I said I did not know yet. That answer was not entirely honest, but it was the closest I could manage. After she left, I opened my planner to a blank page. At the top, I wrote one word: next. Beneath it, I listed practical things. Update resume, review savings, research senior positions, reduce unnecessary expenses. I did not write leave Charlotte. I did not write move away from my parents. Naming the possibility felt too large, almost disloyal. But I began setting aside more money each month. I updated my professional profile and collected examples of events I had successfully managed. I requested copies of performance reviews and organized my references. None of it committed me to anything. That was what I told myself. I was simply preparing. Yet preparation has a way of making an impossible choice feel real. Each small task created a little more distance between the life I had and the life I might choose. My mother knew nothing about the page in my planner. She continued calling with questions, advice, and reminders of what she believed I should want. I continued answering, but something in me had shifted. I no longer assumed that enduring the same pattern forever was the price of being a good daughter. I was beginning to understand that patience without boundaries was not kindness. It was permission. I still did not know where the word next would lead me, but for the first time, I had written it in my own handwriting, and I was no longer willing to let anyone erase it. Writing the word next in my planner did not change my life overnight, but it changed the way I looked at every boundary my mother crossed after that. I began noticing the exact moment concern became intrusion, and once I saw it clearly, I could no longer pretend the difference did not matter. The moment that finally forced me to act came 6 weeks before my birthday, on a Wednesday afternoon at the office. I was meeting with Brooke Whitfield, a bride whose April wedding was one of the most important events on my schedule. The budget was $42,000. The guest list was close to 200, and every detail had been carefully planned around a garden ceremony and a formal seated dinner. Brooke was organized, decisive, and respectful of my time. She had already referred 2 other clients to our firm, which meant the relationship mattered beyond a single contract. We were reviewing the revised seating chart when my office door opened without a knock. My mother stepped inside wearing a coral blouse and carrying a canvas tote bag from a local nursery. She smiled as if she had arrived at my apartment instead of my workplace. "Oh, I didn't realize you were with someone," she said. She claimed she had brought plant clippings she thought I might like, although I had never asked for them and could not remember discussing them. I stood and told her I was in the middle of a client consultation. I asked her to wait outside for 20 minutes. She agreed immediately, but instead of leaving, she set the tote bag on the floor and turned to Brooke. She asked whether Brooke was planning a wedding, then began telling her how talented I had always been with beautiful things. Before I could redirect the conversation, my mother took out her phone and started searching for photographs of a neighbor's wedding. I had helped coordinate 2 summers earlier. Brooke was polite. That made the situation worse. She smiled, asked a few courteous questions, and sat through several minutes of photographs she had never requested. I tried twice to guide us back to the seating chart, but my mother continued talking, touching my shoulder as if we were sharing a charming family moment. She finally left with a cheerful promise that she would see me on Sunday. The door closed behind her, and the room felt different. The professional rhythm I had built with Brooke was gone. I apologized and tried to return to the plans, but she seemed distracted. After 10 minutes, she said she needed to review a few things, and asked to continue the meeting the following week. I knew something had shifted, though I could not yet prove it. The following Monday, Brooke called the firm and said she had decided to take her wedding in a different direction. She was gracious and careful with her words. She did not accuse me of anything. She simply ended the contract. When the call was over, I sat at my desk and stared at the blank space where her name had been on my calendar. $42,000 in business had disappeared after one uninvited visit. What disturbed me most was not the money. Businesses lose clients, and no planner wins every contract. What disturbed me was that my mother had not entered my office intending to sabotage me. She had wanted attention, and the possibility that my work might matter more than her arrival had never truly occurred to her. The damage was not an accident in the ordinary sense. It was the natural result of a belief she had carried for years, the belief that every door in my life opened for her. I called Jess that evening and told her exactly what happened. She listened until I finished, then used a word I would not repeat in polite company. After that, she asked the only question that mattered. "What are you going to do?" I looked around my apartment. My planner was open on the coffee table, and the page marked "Next" was visible from where I sat. Until that moment, the word had represented possibilities. Now it felt like an instruction. I told Jess I was going to plan the birthday party properly. She asked what that meant. I said I wanted a private room and a guest list made up of people who knew me through my work, my friendships, and the life I had built outside my parents' house. I did not want to humiliate my mother or trap her into behaving badly. I wanted one evening where she could not define me before anyone else had the chance to see me clearly. Jess understood. She also understood that I was talking about more than a party. She asked what I needed from her. I told her to be there and pay attention. That was all. The next morning, I began researching venues before work. I looked for a room that felt warm but not sentimental, private but not hidden, elegant without becoming formal. I made notes about capacity, lighting, sound, and entrances. Planning steadied me. It gave shape to something that had lived only as frustration. During lunch, I opened my professional email and noticed a message that had been sitting unopened in a secondary folder. The subject line read, "Senior Director Opportunity, Charlotte to Seattle." I stared at it for several seconds. My first instinct was to close the folder and return to my ordinary responsibilities. Instead, I clicked the message. It was from Harrison and Reed Events, a company I knew by reputation, inviting me to discuss a position with more responsibility, more authority, and a salary large enough to make distance possible. I read the email twice, then once more slowly. Outside my office window, the city looked exactly the same, but something inside me had moved. For the first time, next was no longer just a word on a page. It had a direction. Seattle was more than 2,000 miles from Charlotte, and for 2 full days I treated that distance like a reason not to respond. I told myself the email had probably been sent to several candidates, that I was not ready for a senior role, and that moving across the country would be reckless. Those explanations sounded practical, but underneath them was a simpler truth. I had spent so many years making decisions around my mother's reactions that choosing a life she had not approved felt almost like betrayal. On Saturday morning, I took my laptop to the coffee shop near my apartment and opened the message again. Harrison and Reed Events handled corporate galas, museum fundraisers, and major nonprofit events, with budgets far beyond anything my current firm usually managed. They were looking for a senior director of client experience, someone who could oversee accounts, guide junior planners, and protect client relationships from the first meeting through the final event. The salary was 40% higher than what I earned in Charlotte, and the offer included relocation assistance. More important, the position came with authority. I would not simply solve problems behind the scenes. I would have the power to make decisions before those problems reached anyone else. I scheduled the interview before I could talk myself out of it. The first conversation lasted 40 minutes. The second involved 2 senior executives and a detailed discussion of a foundation gala I had organized the previous spring. They asked how I handled pressure, how I responded when a client changed direction late in the process, and how I managed staff members who were talented but inexperienced. I answered without exaggerating. I knew what I had done, what I had learned, and where I had succeeded. For once, no one interrupted to explain me. A week later, Harrison and Reed sent a formal offer. I read every page carefully. I reviewed the salary, benefits, start date, relocation package, and expectations. Then I waited until the following morning and accepted. I did not call my parents. I did not ask whether Seattle was too far or whether the move made sense. I signed my name and felt my hands tremble, not from doubt, but from the unfamiliar weight of making a permanent decision without permission. The apartment search came next. I remembered Capitol Hill from a conference I had attended years earlier, especially the quiet side streets and the gray light that softened the buildings. I found a 1-bedroom apartment on Olive Way with an east-facing window, a small kitchen, and enough space for a desk near the living room. A coffee shop stood on the corner, and a hardware store was across the street. The landlord arranged a video tour, and I asked every question I would have asked for a client. I confirmed the management company, reviewed the lease, checked the building records, and submitted the deposit through the official rental portal. When the approval arrived, I signed the lease and wrote the address beneath the word "Next" in my planner. Only then did I call Jess. She was quiet for so long that I checked whether the call had disconnected. "You accepted the job," she finally said. I told her I had. "And you signed a lease." I admitted that too. She did not criticize me for waiting. She understood why I needed the decision to become real before anyone else could influence it. Then she asked about the birthday party. By that point, I had already chosen Corkwood, a wine bar in Plaza Midwood, with a private room and a separate entrance from the side street. The space held 35 people comfortably, and had warm lighting, good acoustics, and enough privacy that the evening would not feel like a public performance. I sent the deposit in August and began building the guest list. Every person I invited knew me through something I had chosen. My colleagues knew my work. My college friends knew the person I had been before I learned to filter myself around my mother. Marcus knew how to disagree with someone without fearing punishment. Gerald, my retired neighbor, knew when I was working too late because he saw my lights on across the hall. Jess knew nearly everything. I invited my parents as guests. That distinction mattered to me. I did not ask my mother to select the food, approve the room, or review the names. 3 days after the invitations went out, she called and offered to help with setup. I told her the venue handled it. She suggested floral arrangements. I said they were already included. She asked whether I wanted her to arrive early and supervise. I told her she should come at 7, the same time as everyone else. There was a brief silence, the kind that once would have made me rush to soften my answer. This time, I waited. She finally said she understood and ended the call warmly. A week later, she tried again, suggesting hydrangeas, candles, and family photographs for a display table. I declined each idea. She said she only wanted the evening to feel personal. I told her it already would. After the call, I opened my planner and made 2 notes. The first said, "Birthday confirmed." The second said, "Seattle lease signed." Looking at those 2 lines together, I finally understood what I had built. The party was not the beginning of my escape. It was the last event I would host before leaving Charlotte. My mother believed she was being denied a role in one evening. She had no idea I had already removed her from the decision that would shape the rest of my life. The more carefully I kept Seattle hidden, the more clearly my mother seemed to sense that something had shifted beyond her reach. She could not see the signed lease in my planner or the onboarding documents saved on my laptop, but she could hear the difference in my voice. I no longer rushed to explain every decision, and I no longer filled every silence with reassurance. 8 days before the party, she called again about decorations. She said she had found a woman at the farmer's market who could get beautiful dusty blue hydrangeas and suggested that family photographs would make the room feel warmer. I reminded her that Corkwood already provided centerpieces and that I did not want a display table. She laughed lightly and said I was being too formal about a birthday. I told her I liked the plan exactly as it was. There was a pause, brief but unmistakable. In the past, I would have softened my answer by adding that her idea was lovely or promising we could use it another time. Instead, I let the answer stand. She said she only wanted to help. I replied that arriving as a guest was all the help I needed. Her voice remained pleasant when she said she understood, but I knew my mother well enough to hear the tension underneath it. 5 days before the party, my father called me directly. Ray usually communicated through Sandra unless he had a practical question, so seeing his name on the screen made me sit straighter. He began with, "Hey, sweetheart," in the careful tone he used when he had been asked to smooth over a problem. He told me my mother felt excluded. I said she had been invited to the party and would be seated with everyone else. He explained that she was excited and wanted to feel useful. I told him there was nothing left to organize. The venue had the schedule, the food was confirmed, and the guest list was complete. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know how she is." I had heard those words for most of my life. They had always meant that I was expected to adjust because Sandra would not. This time, instead of agreeing, I asked him what he meant. He stumbled over the answer. He said she took family events seriously and sometimes became emotional when she felt unnecessary. I told him that being unnecessary for one evening was not the same as being unloved. He did not respond immediately. The television murmured in the background, but he did not seem to be watching it. Then he asked whether I was doing all right. There was something unusual in the question, something heavier than ordinary concern. I said I was fine, and asked why he wanted to know. He told me there was no reason, he simply wanted to make sure. Before we ended the call, he confirmed the start time twice. I stood in my kitchen afterward, holding the silent phone and wondering what he was not saying. Ray had spent years avoiding direct conflict, but that call felt different from his usual diplomacy. It felt less like he was trying to convince me, and more like he was checking the condition of a bridge before someone crossed it. 2 days before the party, my mother called one final time. She did not mention flowers. Instead, she asked who would be attending. I gave her a general answer, mostly coworkers and friends from college. She asked whether Marcus would be there. When I said yes, she made a small sound of disapproval. Marcus had once disagreed with her at a family dinner and had not apologized, which in her mind made him rude and disloyal. Then she asked whether there would be speeches. I told her there was no formal program. She said families usually said something at birthdays and offered to prepare a few words. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I said, "Mom, it is not that kind of evening." Her silence lasted long enough for me to count 3 full seconds. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. She said she understood and that she would see me Saturday. After the call, I opened my planner and wrote, "Third attempt to control the party." Beneath it, I added, "She is afraid of something." The sentence stayed with me. My mother had built much of her identity around being needed. She offered help not only because she enjoyed being useful, but because usefulness gave her authority. If I could organize my own celebration, choose my own guests, and make decisions without her approval, then she had to face the possibility that I could build an entire life the same way. She did not know about Seattle, but she could feel the distance forming. The night before the party, I packed 1 box. I chose books I would not need during the next few weeks and wrapped a few framed photographs in towels. When the box was full, I taped it shut and wrote, "Seattle, Books," across the side in thick black marker. I placed it beside the front door, where it would be the first thing I saw in the morning. My apartment was unusually quiet. I made tea, sat on the couch, and listened to the sounds of traffic outside. I thought about my mother's questions, my father's strange concern, and the way both of them seemed to be circling something they would not name. I told myself I had prepared for every possibility. The venue was ready, the guests had confirmed, and my future no longer depended on how the evening went. Still, when I turned off the light, I could not forget the tone in Ray's voice when he asked whether I was all right. It sounded less like a question and more like an apology he had not yet found the courage to make. The uneasiness in my father's voice followed me into Saturday, but by the time I arrived at Corkwood, I had no space left for speculation. The party began at 7, and I reached the venue 45 minutes early because I had spent too many years planning events to trust that everything would somehow arrange itself. The private entrance opened onto a quiet side street in Plaza Midwood, away from the louder bars and weekend traffic. Inside, the room looked almost exactly as I had imagined it. Warm overhead lights softened the dark wood walls, small candles flickered on the tables, and 4 tasting glasses had been placed neatly at every setting. The music I had chosen played low enough for conversation, and the staff had arranged the food stations without making the room feel crowded. I walked the space slowly, checking every detail out of habit. I adjusted 1 chair by half an inch, moved a menu card that no one else would have noticed, and confirmed the timing of the cake with the manager. There were 31 chairs divided among 5 tables. My seat was at table 3, facing the entrance. I always placed myself where I could see who was arriving. At weddings, that position allowed me to catch a late vendor or an anxious relative before a problem spread. That evening, it gave me a clear view of the door my parents would eventually walk through. For a few quiet minutes, I stood in the middle of the room and let myself take it in. Every choice had been mine. No one had replaced my music, changed the guest list, selected a different cake, or decided the room needed family photographs. It was a simple thing, but I felt almost emotional standing there. I had spent years creating spaces where other people felt celebrated. This was the first one I had built for myself. Marcus arrived first, which surprised me because he treated punctuality like a personal insult. He hugged me, looked around, and said the room felt exactly like me, calm on the surface but organized within an inch of its life. Priya and Dana came together from Raleigh, already laughing over an argument they had apparently carried through most of the drive. Gerald, my retired neighbor, wore a sport coat I had never seen before and handed me a yellow envelope with my name written carefully across the front. My coworkers arrived in small groups, bringing spouses, stories, and the easy familiarity of people who had seen me solve impossible problems without making anyone feel foolish. As the room filled, I felt something inside me loosen. These people knew different versions of me, but none of them knew the version my mother had spent years describing. To them, I was not difficult, disappointing, overly serious, or somehow unfinished. I was the person who remembered birthdays, stayed late when a colleague was overwhelmed, fixed last-minute seating disasters, and showed up when I said I would. Jess arrived a little after 7:20 and found me near the bar. She ordered a glass of Pinot Noir and stood beside me, surveying the room with the focused expression of someone quietly checking exits. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," I said, and I meant it. She studied my face for another second, then nodded. We did not discuss my parents or the box beside my apartment door. She knew I did not need another warning. At 7:22, Sandra and Ray entered. They were the last guests to arrive. My mother wore a deep burgundy silk blouse and had styled her hair more carefully than the setting required. My father wore a blazer and looked as though he had changed shirts twice before leaving the house. Sandra paused just inside the doorway and scanned the room. I recognized the movement immediately. She was searching for someone who would acknowledge her importance before she had to introduce herself. No one did. The conversations continued. A few people glanced toward the entrance, saw two unfamiliar guests, and turned back to the people beside them. My mother's smile remained in place, but it tightened slightly. Ray found me first. He hugged me and said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," with an emotion in his voice that felt almost painful. For one moment, I wondered whether he was trying to tell me something through the pressure of his arms. Then he released me and looked toward Sandra. She hugged me next, told me I looked beautiful, and said the room was charming. Charming was one of her careful words. It sounded complimentary while leaving room for correction. I thanked her and led them to table 4, where I introduced them to Patricia from my office and Patricia's partner. Both were gracious and immediately included them in conversation. Once they were settled, I returned to the rest of the room. For the next hour, I did not deliberately watch my mother, but years of event planning had taught me to feel a room without staring at it. I knew where the laughter was strongest, which table needed another bottle of water, and when a conversation had gone quiet. I also knew that Sandra was struggling. She attempted several conversations, but they did not unfold the way she expected. When she told one of my colleagues that I had always been sensitive, the woman smiled and said that sensitivity was probably why clients trusted me. When Sandra mentioned that I sometimes worked too much, another guest praised my leadership during a difficult charity gala. Every attempt to reduce me was met with a version of me she had not created. Ray spoke very little. He kept one hand near his glass, but barely drank. More than once, I caught him looking at Sandra with an expression I could not read. At 8:30, Gerald surprised me with a small chocolate cake and a single candle. Everyone sang. I laughed, made a wish, and blew out the flame. Marcus raised his glass and gave a brief toast about loyalty, competence, and the rare kind of person who made other people's lives feel less chaotic. The room applauded. Across from me, my mother sat perfectly still. Then, at 8:41, she pushed back her chair. The sound was not loud, but I heard it above every conversation. She stood, lifted her chin, and looked around the room as though she had finally found the moment she had been waiting for. The room changed the moment my mother stood. Conversations faded one by one, until even the soft music seemed too loud. Sandra did not tap her glass or wait for permission. She simply looked around at the people gathered there, and lifted her voice with the confidence of someone who believed the room would follow wherever she led. "Can I have everyone's attention for a moment?" she said. 30 faces turned toward her. I remained seated, my fork resting beside a piece of chocolate cake I had barely touched. My father did not look at me. He stared at the table, one hand closed around the stem of his glass, and something about his stillness made the uneasiness I had carried all week sharpen into certainty. My mother smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've been sitting here listening to everyone say such wonderful things about Claire," she began, "and I think family has a responsibility to be honest, even when honesty is difficult." No one moved. The people in that room had expected a birthday toast, perhaps an embarrassing childhood story, or a sentimental message from a mother to her daughter. Instead, Sandra looked directly at me and said, "We never really loved you, not the way parents are supposed to love a child. I don't know why, and I'm not proud of it, but I think you deserve to hear the truth." The silence that followed felt physical. It pressed against my skin and settled over the tables. Someone near the bar inhaled sharply. Patricia lowered her glass. Jess stood completely still, with both hands resting against the edge of her chair. I looked at my mother and waited for the pain to arrive in the form she expected. She wanted tears. She wanted me to ask what I had done wrong. She wanted proof that she still possessed the power to define my worth with a single sentence. For years, that power had been real. A cold look from her could ruin my week. A dismissive comment could make me question an accomplishment I had worked months to earn. But standing there beneath the warm lights, surrounded by people who knew the life I had built, I saw her differently. I saw the fear beneath the cruelty. She had entered a room where no one needed her explanation of who I was. She had listened as people praised qualities she had spent years reducing. She had watched me celebrate without asking her permission, and she could not tolerate the possibility that I no longer required her approval. Her announcement was not a confession. It was an attempt to pull me back into the role she understood. If she could humiliate me badly enough, perhaps I would become the daughter who apologized, adjusted, and returned to her for reassurance. I set down my fork. Then I placed my plate on the table with both hands, because I did not want it to shake. I counted 3 seconds, breathing slowly through each one. My mother remained standing, holding her wineglass near her chest. My father finally raised his eyes, and the expression on his face was not surprise. It was dread. That realization landed somewhere deep inside me, but I did not examine it yet. There would be time for that later. I pushed back my chair and stood. My mother watched me carefully. I could almost see the speech she expected me to make. I did not give it to her. "Thank you for the honesty," I said. My voice was clear enough to carry across the room. Then I reached behind my chair and picked up my coat. I looked toward Jess. Her face was pale, but she understood immediately. We had discussed no signal, made no emergency plan, and agreed on no script. None was necessary. She knew I was not leaving because I had lost control. I was leaving because I had finally claimed it. I walked toward the private entrance. No one tried to stop me. As I passed table 4, my father shifted as though he might stand, but he remained seated. My mother said my name once, softly at first, then more sharply when I did not turn around. I opened the door, and cool October air rushed into the room. The street outside was quiet, lit by a row of amber lamps. I stepped through and let the door close behind me. For the first time in my life, I did not look back to see whether my mother was angry. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. My hands rested in my lap. The dashboard clock read 8:57. I could hear faint music from the busier street 2 blocks away, but inside the car there was only silence. I expected to feel broken. Instead, I felt exhausted and strangely light, as though someone had finally spoken aloud the thing I had spent years trying to disprove. My grandmother used to say that truth always found a way out. I had once believed that was a warning. Sitting there, I understood it could also be an exit. 5 minutes later, my phone began to ring. My father's name appeared first. I watched it until the screen went dark. Then my mother called. Then Ray again. Messages followed from people inside the party, asking whether I was safe and where I had gone. I started the car and drove to Jess's apartment. She arrived shortly after I did and opened the door before I could knock. She said nothing. She made tea, set a glass of water in front of me, and waited until I was ready. Later, she told me what happened after I left. Danielle from my office had walked to my mother's table and asked whether she understood that she had just told her daughter she was unloved at her own birthday celebration. One by one, guests collected their coats and left without comforting Sandra. The room had not turned against me. It had simply refused to protect her from what she had done. By midnight, my phone had lit up dozens of times. I ignored every call. I thought the worst revelation of the night had already been spoken in front of 30 people. Then I remembered the look on my father's face before I walked out, and I realized he had not been shocked by my mother's words at all. That look on my father's face stayed with me through the night, even after the calls stopped and the apartment grew quiet. By morning, I had slept only in fragments on Jess's couch, waking each time my phone lit the room. When I finally sat up, there were dozens of notifications waiting for me. I counted 53 missed calls before I stopped. 9 were from my father, 4 were from my mother. The rest came from relatives, family friends, and people who had already heard some version of what happened. The first message I opened was from Ray, sent just before midnight. He asked me to call because my mother was extremely upset. A second message, sent after 2 in the morning, asked whether I knew the password to their insurance portal. I stared at that one longer than the others. Hours after my mother had told a room full of people that she had never loved me, my father was asking me to solve another problem for them. By breakfast, he had sent another message asking about a medical appointment Sandra had later that week. He had found it on the calendar, but did not know who had scheduled it, or why. I had arranged it 2 months earlier. That was when I understood how completely my work had disappeared inside our family. They had become so accustomed to me handling everything that they no longer recognized the handling as an act of care. The appointments appeared. The prescriptions were ready. The accounts worked. As long as I kept everything running, no one had to wonder who was keeping it alive. Jess sat across from me at the kitchen table, holding her coffee with both hands. She did not ask me to forgive anyone or make a decision immediately. She simply watched me read. I told her I had known for years what my mother was capable of. Not those exact words, but the instinct behind them. I had seen the way she punished independence, the way she reduced success, and the way she pushed into spaces that did not belong to her. Still, I had stayed. I had kept adjusting and smoothing and fixing. I called it patience, I said, but I think it was fear. Jess asked what I had been afraid of. The answer came more easily than I expected. I was afraid that leaving would mean admitting all the years I had spent trying to make the family work had changed nothing. If I walked away, I would have to accept that loyalty had not made my mother kinder or my father braver. Staying allowed me to believe one more carefully managed conversation might finally be enough. My phone rang again. This time, it was Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. She did not begin with a greeting. She said she was not calling to ask me to return. Then she told me that what Sandra said was not a truth about me. It was a truth about Sandra. I felt my throat tighten for the first time since leaving the party. Carol asked whether I was going somewhere. I looked toward the window and said, Seattle. It was the first time I had spoken the name of my new city to anyone in the family. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Good. That single word gave me more permission than years of explanations ever had. Later that afternoon, my father called again. I answered because I needed one question resolved before I could close the door completely. His voice sounded older than it had the week before. He apologized for not stopping Sandra. I asked whether he knew what she planned to say. The silence on the line answered before he did. He admitted that she had told him she wanted to say something honest at the party, something she believed I needed to hear. He said he had tried to discourage her gently. He thought she might change her mind once she saw everyone gathered there. He had not warned me because he did not want to create a larger conflict before the evening began. I asked him whether he understood what that meant. He said my name, but I stopped him. My mother had chosen cruelty. My father had chosen comfort. He had known there was a possibility she intended to wound me publicly, and he had decided preserving peace with his wife mattered more than protecting his daughter. He began to cry. I did not. I told him I loved him, because that was still true, but love did not erase what he had done. Then I ended the call. That evening, I returned to my apartment and opened my laptop. I sent formal notice to my employer, confirming that I was leaving for a position in Seattle. After that, I removed myself as the authorized contact from my parents' accounts. I placed their passwords, appointment information, doctor contacts, and insurance details into one organized document and emailed it to both of them. It was not punishment. I did not delete anything, cancel anything, or leave them without the information they needed. I simply stopped being responsible for whether they used it. Ray eventually learned how to reset the insurance password himself. Sandra missed the appointment I had scheduled because no one remembered to confirm it. For years, I had protected them from every consequence of their inattention. Now I allowed those consequences to belong to the people who created them. I packed another box that night and sealed it beside the first. As the tape crossed the cardboard, I understood that my mother's words had opened the door, but my father's confession made the decision final. There was no version of that house I could return to without becoming invisible again. This time, I was not leaving in anger. I was leaving because I had finally accepted that silence could betray a person just as deeply as cruelty. Claire's story reminds me that the most painful betrayal is not always a cruel sentence. Sometimes, it is years of silence, excuses, and invisible labor that teach one person to carry everyone, while asking for nothing. Claire did not win because her parents suffered after she left. She won because she stopped measuring her value through people who only noticed her when they needed something. That is the lesson I would take from her experience. Do not wait until a relationship destroys your confidence before setting a boundary. Pay attention when concern becomes control, when helping becomes an obligation, and when keeping the peace always requires the same person to surrender. You should communicate clearly, protect your financial and emotional independence, and build relationships with people who respect you without demanding constant sacrifice. At the same time, do not leave in a moment of uncontrolled anger if you can prepare safely and thoughtfully. Organize your responsibilities, protect important documents, seek support from trustworthy friends, and make decisions that lead toward stability rather than revenge. Most importantly, do not confuse forgiveness with renewed access. You can release bitterness without returning to the role that harmed you. Family should not require you to disappear so others can remain comfortable. Sometimes walking away is not abandonment. It is the first honest act of self-respect and the beginning of a life where your kindness is freely given instead of silently taken.